In this video, we'll take a look at Virginia Woolf's search for Shakespeare's sister in her essay, A Room of One's Own. Woolf was born in England in 1882 and died in 1941. This gives her a unique perspective, having grown up at the tail end of the Victorian era and then living and trying to establish a career as a writer in a new century, in a modern and ever-changing world. And her work captures that. She's a modernist writer, both in her style and in her subject matter. One of her most famous novels, Mrs. Dalloway, employs a stream of consciousness style of writing that flickers back and forth between different narratives, past and present, and responds in many ways to the traumas of World War I. And her novel Orlando, also an experimental novel that chronicles a character who is essentially immortal and changes gender throughout the centuries, so that we see her exploring gender roles, sexuality, and so many other topics in a distinctive voice and in quite revolutionary ways. This week, we're reading an excerpt from her lengthy essay, A Room of One's Own, which was published in 1929. And in this work, she seeks to really carve out a space for women. It's kind of a call to arms for women writers and artists and just any women, really, to look back at history, to question how women have been represented in history, and to demand a new future, a new present for women who want more from life than has traditionally been given them, and is now in the history of feminism and particularly feminist literary criticism, a key, monumental work. It looks in particular at the educational, social, and financial disadvantages that women have faced throughout history, which has often impacted what little they have been able to contribute to history as Woolf knew it. And that's something that we'll talk a little bit about in this video, that, even in the 1920s, Woolf's access to a real history of England or a history of women is much more scant than the one we now have. And you wouldn't think history could change that much, but what kind of history we record and we teach and we make readily available, and who we decide to give emphasis to, that does change. There are likely works by women we still have yet to uncover and may still. At any rate, one of the kind of most famous quotes from which we get the title of this work is Woolf's declaration that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. And what she means by this is that, traditionally a married woman who was working in the home as a mother, as a housewife, would not have space for herself, money for herself, by which she could feel secure and independent and able to pursue her dreams. And so in this new era in the 20th century, we're looking for women who don't have to marry just to survive, who could choose to marry just because they want to. And whether they're married or single, they can have a profession, they can make money, and they can be secure. And then they have the freedom to write and really put their voices out there without fear of reprisal or of someone trying to silence them. But what Woolf is really looking at in the part of A Room of One's Own that we are reading this week is that there's this whole history of women who never had a chance, and that even in the 20th century, as women are, securing the vote, are entering into the workforce in new ways, are increasingly being published. I mean, we see with the 19th and 18th century even many women voices coming into the fray, but they were still predominantly upper class for quite some time. Woolf is really, in this work, calling out for all women to carve their way into history, to make history, whether it be through writing or any kind of women's lived experience. A Room of One's Own is, in many ways, an argumentative essay, but it is established as a work of fiction in some senses, too. The narrator is a fictional character named Mary, and Mary visits the British Museum to find out everything that has ever been written about women. And she's quite disappointed by what she sees and what she doesn't see. She finds that women are often left out, and what's included about them paints a pretty sad picture. So Woolf's essay essentially argues that literature and history is a predominantly male construct that has marginalized women throughout each century. And throughout this piece, she defends women writers and women in general against long-held opinions that women are inferior as writers, thinkers, human beings. And she instead looks at how the gaps in history where we don't see much about women comes from their social circumstances, from the ways in which they were cut out of the same kind of lived experience as men, and hence the men made history. So throughout the essay, she looks at, for instance, women not receiving education, being barred for quite a long time from attending school or university, being left out of inheritance, expected to marry, and simply keep house and rear children, and not have the ability to choose if that's what she wanted or not. And in the excerpt that we are looking at, she imagines a kind of symbol of all women writers, and particularly women writers before the 18th or 19th century. She says, what if Shakespeare had a talented sister named Judith? And what might her life have been like? What if she tried to establish herself in the world of the theater and literature like Shakespeare? What would have happened to her? And of course, she concludes that Judith would have been so thwarted and hindered by other people, so tortured and pulled asunder by her own contrary instincts, that she must have lost her health and sanity. And so she paints a rather dispiriting picture, but she doesn't leave it there. Ultimately, A Room of One's Own in general, and the Shakespeare sister portion we're reading in particular, is a call to action. It says that women deserve a place in the world and in literature. They deserve the independence to find their way, just like men have historically been able to. And doing that, being able to have a room of one's own, and think of that metaphorically. What does it mean to have space in the world? This depends upon equality, employment opportunities, freedom from marrying only out of necessity. This is what A Room of One's Own is all about. The section on Shakespeare's sister is certainly one of the most well-known parts of this essay, and in it, Woolf asks, I think, some important questions that we have been grappling with this semester. She asks, why aren't there more great women writers to be found in history? And considering that we've spent the past 7 weeks studying women writers that have come before Woolf, that might seem like a strange question to you, but think back. When we first started, we were looking at women of the medieval era. It was a handful of women writers that we could put names to. And even as we then looked into the 17th and 18th century and were exposed to more writers, many of them were still the exceptions. They were highly educated. Some of them were nobility even. They were not the common woman. As we moved into the 19th century, there was an explosion of women writers. It became a popular profession for women, and yet they were still the exception. Working class women were not writing novels. Many middle class women were not, statistically speaking. And of course, even today, most of us aren't writing novels. But we could if we wanted to. We could try. When Woolf is writing this, when she is, like her fictional Mary, out there studying, reading, trying to find a lineage of women writers in history, she does not have access to the same kind of materials that we do. Our anthologies, the Norton Anthology of Women's Literature, that is recent. Some of the authors we have read and that are contained within these textbooks were not available in Woolf's age. And that might seem strange to think, like, well, where did they go and how did we find them? But textbooks, libraries, bookstores, they've always depended upon market forces about who wanted to read what. And for quite a long time, men's literature was privileged over women's. There was not necessarily an interest in going back to the 18th century, the 17th century, and earlier, and trying to find women's voices. So that would really come with historians and literary scholars later in the 20th century who resurrected and discovered works that Virginia Woolf wouldn't have known. I mean, she was a big fan of the Brontes in the 19th century. She read and loved Aphra Behn, who we read earlier in the semester, but if we were to look up all of the authors that are in our textbook and see when their work was rediscovered, I think you'd be surprised by how many have only recently been taught or been published in a way that is accessible to your average everyday person. So when Woolf is looking at women's literature and women's history, she's seeing even less than we are, and this horrifies her. As a woman trying to make her way as an author and trying to find women's voices that have come before her as inspiration, as a way to feel connection, she's not seeing that. What she does see in women's history is violence, is exclusion, is silence, and she's trying to figure out how to grapple with that. And in the process, it does end up inspiring her to create this idea of Shakespeare's sister. So after looking at how women in history were represented, she says, okay, let's do a thought experiment. Let's imagine Shakespeare had a sister and she was talented too. How would she try to make her way in the world? And she, theorizes that Judith, this imagined sister, would lack the same opportunities, and she would have a life of repression and submission, and she couldn't become a Shakespeare. It wouldn't have been possible for her. And so for Woolf, she believes that there were always women of genius, but often they were never able to fulfill their potential. They were married off, they were beaten, silenced, they died in childbirth, they committed suicide. Of course, this is not every woman, but Woolf is looking at crumbs of history and trying to figure out, well, what happened to these women? Surely I'm not alone. Surely there have always been women with imaginations and intellect, but where have they been? Why weren't they writing? Why can't we read them? And of course, Woolf concludes in a quotation that has often been drawn from this work, that probably for much of human history, Anonymous has been a woman. And that, is likely the case, but Woolf wants names, she wants heroes, she wants women she can look to and talk about. And if she can't find enough of them in history, she's going to encourage the women around her to take up their pens, to find their independence, and write their way into history. And thinking about Shakespeare's sister, about this imagined Judith who, in trying to be like her brother, suffers deeply and meets a tragic end. That's the only way Woolf can imagine history treating a woman. She says, okay, it's time for women writers to kind of give birth to Shakespeare's sister, to honor all of the women who came before and didn't get to have their voices, and, take up their cause, take up their pen, and make their sacrifices mean something. Woolf imagines what a sister of Shakespeare might have experienced. Now, William Shakespeare's history is often debated. There's only so much that we know about him, and there's actually a ton of conspiracy theories that he didn't even exist and somebody else wrote his work, or multiple people, but we won't go down that rabbit hole. If we operate on the general consensus of what Shakespeare's life was likely like, he would have gone to grammar school, not university, but at grammar school he would have received education in Latin, logic. He would have read great works of literature like Ovid and Horace, and we know this because we can see traces of these influences in his work. We can see allusions to great works of literature in his plays, and so he did receive an education of some kind. Judith, Shakespeare's sister, would not have. Woolf theorizes that maybe she would have learned to read, and even that would be, again, we've read highly educated upper-class women writers from that era. They were few and far between, but let's assume Shakespeare's sister did learn to read. Maybe she read books that her brother or her father had in between her chores, but she would not have had the opportunity to receive the same kind of education as Shakespeare. And any writing she might have done, she would have kept secret, Woolf thinks. Now, Shakespeare gets married young to a slightly older woman. She has a child. He leaves them, goes off to London. He goes and sows his wild oats. He has the freedom to move and experiment and kind of find his way in life. And on the other hand, what would happen to Shakespeare's sister? Woolf theorizes that surely, like many young women, her father would have said, here, you're going to marry this guy. And if she tried to protest, Woolf says that even if her father loved her and she was the apple of his eye, he would have felt shamed, he would have felt disappointed, he might even have beaten her until she would fall into line. But Shakespeare's sister, Woolf's Judith, runs away. She won't stand for it. She is the rarity. She is not your every woman. She's a rebel. But if she tried to run away to London, what would her experience have been like? Compared to Shakespeare, who we know, or at least we think we know, kind of climbed the career ladder. It's said that at first he was kind of a stable boy for playhouses, and then he was an actor, and then he was a playwright, and he just kept, climbing his way up. He had the ability to do so. He's unique, of course, in all of human history. The great figures we learn about are not representative of everybody. They're still rare. But he had opportunities and he had mobility, social mobility, that a woman would not have. And so, as Woolf tells us, he lived at the hub of the universe, meeting everybody, knowing everybody, practicing his art on the boards, exercising his wit in the streets, and even getting access to the palace of the queen. Not Shakespeare. What would Judith's life have looked like if she ran away to go to London and try to make it as an artist, as an actress, as a playwright? Well, for one thing, women weren't allowed to act at this point. It didn't become legal for that to happen until the next century. And so she would have been laughed off. She would have been scorned. And who would have taken her writing seriously? Could she have maybe tried to shop it around anonymously, but how would she make the connections? Well, Woolf imagines that maybe at some point an actor/manager would take pity on her. But what did she even mean by that? It seems to be a euphemism, because we see very quickly in this part of Shakespeare's sister that Woolf says this guy took pity on her. She found herself with child, and then she killed herself. So this could likely be a reference to rape or a coerced relationship, in the sense that Judith would not have had many other options as a runaway woman in the city of London. And so she becomes a fallen woman. She becomes a tragic figure. This is the history of women writers that Woolf imagines, with very few exceptions. And sure, this is a thought experiment. It's used to help advance Woolf's argument that women need to, kind of really make a stink and claim their place in the world as writers and as citizens. But it doesn't seem too far off, having read so many writers this semester that were very anxious about their work and felt that they were ridiculed and compared to men and seen as less than. This doesn't seem too far off the mark. So ultimately, this is a call to arms. Remember Shakespeare's sister. Woolf tells us at the end of this section of the essay, I told you in the course of this paper that Shakespeare had a sister. Now it is my belief that this poet, who never wrote a word and was buried at the crossroads, still lives. She lives in you and me, and in many other women who are not here tonight, for they are washing up the dishes and putting the children to bed. My belief is that we live another century or so. Then the opportunity will come, and the dead poet who was Shakespeare's sister will be born. And so here Woolf is calling for solidarity, calling for a kind of sisterhood of writers to support each other. She's encouraging them to do what their forebearers could not. Even the women who are still, trapped in lives in which they don't feel like they have a lot of options. She's imagining that they can carry on the flame of this imaginary Shakespeare sister, that her dreams, her hopes is in each one of them, and we need to encourage that. And yet, she's still kind of skeptical because she says we might not see this female genius for another century. There are still hurdles in place. There are still objections to women's independence, to women's voices. And we know from our own study of history that it was long past the 1920s that women were struggling for equality, and there are still struggles today in a lot of minority groups in which women are still included. So, and maybe a writer today or in recent decades would be the kind of genius, the kind of Shakespeare sister that Woolf had hoped for. It would be interesting to see what she would think of women writing today.